What is up? Happy Thursday and a happy Pi Day, my IT friends. I did a thing, and we're going to talk about it in a minute. But first, I married a math teacher. Today is Pi Day. Out of all of the mathematical constants, and there are way more than you care to know about, pi is one of the coolest. If you have touched or interacted with anything that's round, which we all have, you've interacted with pi. So go find a math nerd friend, ask them why it's a cool constant. You probably won't. Whatever. So the thing that I did that I want to talk a little bit about today, I went to an ecosystem convention for an ITSM platform where the audience really isn't MSPs. And I did it for a few reasons, but it was a very interesting experience to be somewhere where it was mostly sysadmins and like Fortune 5000s as the audience at a platform ecosystem convention. And I had some takeaways that I wanted to bring to some of the MSPs and some of the MSP vendors that I picked up from this convention. So the other day I went to ServiceNow Summit in Boston. It was a local platform ecosystem event, not dissimilar from those that ConnectWise Kaseya have, although it was way better attended. And I thought that was pretty interesting. There was probably easily 300 people there. And typical things you would expect from an IT conference. The ratio was completely screwed and skewed towards mostly people who looked like men in the room. You had that typical blend of dress shirts with vests, dress shirts with sport coat. You guys know what I'm talking about. It's your generic business casual IT event. They did a very nice job, as I would expect any large platform company to do, well organized, yada yada. They did pay for parking as well, which was kind of cool. And all in all, good experience, good event. And if you're considering using ServiceNow, I don't really know a lot about their platform, but from what I saw at this one event, they seem to have their act together. So what I decided to do was that I would attend there, both just to learn about their ecosystem, because it helped. We do have clients that use ServiceNow, and I think it's important that we understand the ecosystem, but also because just the part of me that likes to gossip and spy on the world and people watch, I was kind of curious to see how the other half lives, since for the most part, ServiceNow isn't really in the MSP ecosystem, although it's totally a platform an MSP could use, just isn't really one that we tend to find a lot in the MSP ecosystem. And so it was interesting and a little bit refreshing to go to an IT event that wasn't just MSP at every single moment during the event, and to see kind of the theme of the event and what they talked about. So I tried to attend all of the official ServiceNow things like the keynote, and then I tried to pick the same types of talk tracks I would pick at a similar event for an MSP tool, just to see how the content compared. And I had a couple of takeaways I wanted to share with everybody. So the biggest takeaway I got was that entire ecosystem, way more so than the big platform ecosystems we currently have in MSP land, really was trying to nail down this idea that they are a single source for the entirety of your needs. CRM, ITSM, asset management, device management, reporting, logging, everything. And it was interesting to see what they were able to show the platform was able to do because they had a closed and curated ecosystem. It reminded me quite a bit when I used to sell a home theater equipment of the Bose experience in the early 2000s, or the modern Apple experience now to anybody who's on the Apple ecosystem. They were able to do a little more than I think most of us are used to being able to do because we're not working out of a closed ecosystem. And I just thought that was an interesting takeaway. And they showed some really, really interesting AI augmentation for their ticketing and just the use case of it was much more refined than what I tend to see at the average MSP, even if you've fully gone in on the two major platform ecosystems that we have, Kaseya and ConnectWise. One of the first things I noticed, and I saw it was a consistent theme throughout the event, that I wanted to compliment our space on. A lot of what I saw both the ServiceNow vendors and ServiceNow itself selling against was this idea that hey, IT admin, you just have so many siloed tools that can't talk to each other, and boy does that suck. Which absolutely it sucks, and lots of nodding in the room. It was mentioned in almost every single talk track, and I saw lots of people in the room like, yeah, I hate that. And ServiceNow kept kind of pushing this idea that like, hey, on our platform, the tools all talk to each other, they're not siloed. And I appreciated that, hearing that, because I'm like, I really don't have that problem very often anymore in the MSP world, mostly because all of the vendors, even the vendors that don't really like each other, we've made a real effort in the MSP space to have all of our tools try to talk to, communicate, and play nice with each other. And there's definitely, as much as I've ragged on it in the last few videos about the conference landscape, there's definitely been a push, I think, from a lot of vendors at the behest of MSPs to be more cooperative. So I didn't really find myself sitting there and thinking, oh yeah, I also had 5 completely siloed tools at my MSP. I share that pain point. I was actually thinking, wow, I haven't actually really had that problem in over a decade, really, when I think about it. That's kind of cool. So I like that. Good job, MSPs. That was kind of cool to hear. The thing I noticed that was interesting and a little bit different from the typical MSP convention, and I suspect there's a couple reasons for that, but there was a big theme of using AI, specifically generative AI, to the point where the keynote speaker jokingly said, let's play a drinking game every time generative AI is said. But everything there was really talking about it as a given that the organizations that were full stack consuming ServiceNow are using some sort of generative AI, whether it's someone else's model or their own model they've trained, and that is a de facto component of how they run their organization. And you don't really hear it said that way at MSP events. We tend to view AI as yet another potential tool in our tool belt, one that I think a lot of us are a little bit suspicious of. And it was interesting for a variety of reasons, because right away it showed the difference in the tone of the audience. The average MSP is running a for-profit IT support business. And while we certainly want automation to minimize efficiency, we're not necessarily motivated to have automation that will replace the need to buy from us. And since this was mostly an internal and Sysadmin Conference, they're really running cost center IT departments. They don't really have that objection, literally, or just as a thought experiment. So there was a lot more comfort, which is assuming that AI was a part of their support experience. And as a result of that, there seemed to be greater familiarity with the language around AI with all of the attendees there. I saw a lot of nodding heads, a lot less phones being pulled out to take pictures of AI slides. The way you see, you guys know what I'm talking about. When you're at a show and there's a new idea presented, everybody's like, oh wow, I got to get a picture of that. Like there was a lot less of that around the AI topics. And it wasn't when I looked around because people were disinterested. It was more everybody was like, be like if you went to an MSP show and you're like, hey, you need a PAM tool. Like everybody's gonna be like, yes, I do. And I have one. Like nobody's gonna be pulling out their camera anymore to be like, wow, what a great idea. I got to bring home to the bosses. We're all just in agreement. It was that same vibe. And, I thought that was pretty cool. And ServiceNow is able to demonstrate some things that I'm not really used to seeing demonstrated at the ecosystem level by the major platforms in the MSP space. I'm used to seeing pushed by individual vendors who are trying to get you to bolt it on to the ecosystem. And a lot of that was really just allowing these generative models to assist support agents with providing first line support more effectively, more efficiently, or quicker. And it was just an interesting tone to see how they were doing it. And to connect these dots back, a couple of people were talking about RPA tools, and RPA tools were being approached as this new concept. So the whole thing was very interesting. Whereas in our space now, you go to a convention, very typical that RPA tools are very normal. Most people at this point could say, hey, you're going to use your scripting or your RPA to fire off a task, but it's human initiated. At this conference, they're basically saying the AI has figured out what needs to happen. And now typically you have a human take it from there. But what if you used RPA to automate that workflow? And that was the part where people were like, wow, click, click, this is an amazing concept. Just thought that was interesting. So this leads me into a concept that I saw a lot of people put in their presentations, and I overheard in a lot of hallway conversations that I don't tend to really hear at MSP events. And it's not an unfamiliar concept to any of us. I'm not used to hearing the majority of the attendees talk about it like a normal thing. And that was this idea of having a ticket deflection percentage and an amount of tickets that you wanted to deflect from your help desk. Those that know me and know my passion for operations, I'm really big on this. I don't use that term, but I'm really big on this because I think that phone calls and long-winded chat or email interactions are high opportunity cost. They slow down your ability to render service. And while many of our individual employees at clients might appreciate having a friendly chat with you about the weather, sports of their dog, I think overall the industry of people that we support as IT providers, they're not looking forward to getting on the phone with the IT support to hang out and fix computer problems. We are, for lack of a better term, tactical plumbers here. They're happy we're there, we're fixing the leak, but they don't really want to talk to us. And so I thought it was interesting that the sort of sysadmin Fortune 5000 space had kind of already adopted that. Well, of course. And so let's work to make that a defined metric. And I saw people saying as much as 20 to 30% ticket deflection, with this idea that you're going to use AI, you're going to use a UI platform. And we do have those things in the MSP world, help desk buttons, cloud radio, the green one that I can't remember right now from Australia, Enviro. We have products that do that, whose whole point is to try and deflect from your help desk. But that's not really if I got 100 MSP owners in a room and I said, hey, what's your ticket deflection strategy? I don't think I would get a lot of answers, if any. And I think a lot of people would be like, why would I want to do that? So I just thought that was really interesting to see how they had kind of tried to bake that frontline efficiency into their support models to the point where I could see that ServiceNow was trying to catch up with what the industry demand was, not leading the industry demand there. They were trying to say, hey, here's all the stuff we're adding in our next release that's going to help you with ticket deflection. Something else that bemused me a little bit, and this is going to surprise nobody, that I think obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously. No, obviously. The MSP space is doing a lot better. So one of the sessions I was in was around asset management, and it was all the stuff that you would typically expect in selecting an asset management tool, all the standard fare that we would hear from pretty much any RMM or documentation vendor, kind of combining their pitches. And that's something that we've been hit with for over a decade in this space, since products like IT Glue, IT Boost, Hoodoo, really started coming in and suggesting stop using Confluence and SharePoint to save all your documentation. And it was this idea of not only asset tracking, but financial reporting. And my friends, I am here to tell you, this was the most adorable thing ever. I jokingly say on some of these videos, my trunk slaying friends, let me tell you, there are one-man trunk slaying shops that have a break fix, walk up to the desk model that have more robust financial tracking mechanisms than what I was seeing being proudly presented to the room. Now, obviously, some of that is the nature of the business. We are all running for-profit IT departments. It is literally a part of our business model to have financial accountability. But right there, I saw the de facto difference between an ITSM and a PSA. Your typical PSA is built to combine from the ground up financial tracking capabilities into your ITSM. That was a bolt-on feature, and it was a bolt-on feature that a lot of people in the room weren't even paying attention to. I thought that was amusing. So good job, MSPs. When our corporate overlords eventually do buy us all up, they will be enamored with the quality of data we can provide to the C-suite on asset tracking and financials for the IT department. Another thing that I found during that conference to be really interesting was the metrics and KPIs everybody in the room took for granted. When you go to events of any community, it doesn't have to be IT. It could be if you go to a dental convention, a legal convention. I don't know. When my wife goes to one of the MTA teaching conventions, there's going to be some in-industry jargon and some in-industry best-in-class metric words that are just taken for granted that everyone in the room likely understands and will be a part of the pitch of both the hosts and then all the ecosystem vendors. And I think we're all used to this, right? We have an MSP. What I thought was interesting were the metrics and KPIs that I kept hearing being mentioned in the room that were clearly intended to be something that everyone in the room already understood without definition. There was a lot of talk in all of these different presentations around SLAs. And while I do think in the last few years, the MSP space, the average MSP could probably do an okay job trying to explain an SLA to me. I would still bet that most of you probably don't really know how SLAs work, like fundamentally, and probably aren't really measuring them in a way that's truly meaningful. And it was interesting to see that at this convention, that was almost such a commonly understood concept the way it should be that it was a throwaway metric. It was sort of the way you might hear in our space somebody say utilization, where everyone they're like, yes, utilization, how much time I can use my techs have entered, the age-old industry term, 20 years of knowledge, we all know what it is. It was kind of like that, but with SLAs. I thought that was interesting. And then there were a lot of metrics that were around reducing the amount of time to triage, the amount of initial troubleshooting time, a lot less focus on resolution than I'm used to hearing from IT people, and a lot more focus on the initial experience of the end users. If I had to sum it up in English, it sounded a lot more at their convention like metrics to not piss off the people that you work with versus us, which are much more metrics to drive profitability. Just thought that was interesting. And it was interesting to see the exact same points being driven home by both the ServiceNow and the vendors that we would see at any other conference, but around that language instead of the language we're typically used to. And that brings me to a refreshing change. It was nice to attend a conference of any type, but especially a platform conference, where there were two things that I was not getting hammered in the face with everywhere I went. No one was talking about M&As, and no one was just hemorrhaging security stuff to me. Not that neither one of those things is important. They're both important. But there was just a lot less of that at this event. And that was pleasantly refreshing, just for a change, to not have every single pitch be about how it'll help you value your business and exit, or about 20 new scary security things that you didn't know about. I'm not trying to imply that people at this event didn't care about security. It just clearly wasn't the selling focus of the event, which was kind of refreshing and nice to just not hear for 5 minutes. So I appreciated that. And then last but not least, there were two ancillary things that I noticed. This was a regional ecosystem event, and while it was larger than the typical regional ecosystem events I see in the MSP space, it was the same probably size in terms of intended spend. So there was only like 8 vendors there, and none of these vendors had massive booths or anything, just so everybody kind of is on that page. But what I thought was interesting was there was way less of a tone. All these vendors, just like you would notice at like a ConnectWise or a Kaseya convention, made a product that either was on the ServiceNow marketplace or somehow implemented or offered a bolt-on feature directly to the platform, much like what you would expect at an ecosystem convention MSP. But there was way less of an effort to have prizes, to have really interesting swag. Nobody was giving out t-shirts. Just the tone of the vendors was a little different, which I thought was interesting. There was still stuff. I mean, people still had, bottle openers, charging pads, keychains, moleskin notebooks, like all the basic stuff was still there. And one or two people were giving away things, but I could just tell like everybody wasn't doing it. And that definitely wasn't the culture and the tone of why you went to this event. This was not an event that you went to spend time with vendors to learn about solutions. This was definitely an event where there just happened to be vendors that were available for you to talk to. So that was interesting. That happens at MSP events as well. But the other thing that I just wanted to shout out to ServiceNow for doing an awesome job with. So I'm a big fan of being cheap. So I tend to try to eat at whatever the food is the event is providing whenever possible. And most of the events I go to do a pretty decent job with a basic buffet. Buffet here was phenomenal. It's probably one of the best buffets I've ever seen. They had these little like pan-seared salmons, and then they had steak tips. And both the salmon and the steak tips were actually pretty decent. Like I would say like at least high-end chain restaurant grade, which was very surprising. So shout out to ServiceNow and the Westin in Boston. Nice job. That was a pleasant surprise. I'm not used to seeing that. And picking up the parking tab was also a nice touch. I know that plenty of conferences do that when they can, but I did like the fact that I was able to attend this conference basically for free, which was super cool. And given the size of it, I'm not used to free conferences in the MSP space being that well attended. So just thought I'd share some of those takeaways with all of you today. And probably the biggest thing I learned from being there overall is if I was one of these Fortune 5000s who leaned 100% into one of these ITSM ecosystems like ServiceNow, I don't really need you, MSPs. And I say that as an MSP evangelist. What I saw from that platform, the pain points I saw them advertising to, and the solutions they were able to provide, short of maybe a project or a pen testing type of engagement, they've pretty much developed an ecosystem. If you're able to implement it at scale, I don't really need a lot of the products and tools and offerings the average MSP would use to sell against that. I'm not saying that MSPs aren't necessary, but I do think it's important that we keep our eye on the other side of the industry, because they're not sitting back. And while they're approaching those problems differently than we might approach them, they are approaching them and they are solving them, and they're adopting some technologies that we don't in a way that for the most part, I'm not sure that we can quite as smoothly, at least not yet. And I could easily see a day where co-managed at that size really starts to come off the table for us. I don't think that's much to be worried about, because I don't think that's the core line of business for most MSPs that are in this space. I don't think most of us are targeting Fortune 5000s for co-manage, but some of us are, or I think some of us have had that in the back of our heads that that's what our ICP will be when we get bigger. I'm not entirely convinced that space is really going to need us that much if what I saw at this conference is indicative of the ecosystem tools that space is using. Something to be aware of. Y'all should check out ServiceNow. It's actually pretty cool. Have a great Thursday. Happy St. Patrick's Day. And don't forget, today's Pi Day. Math constants are awesome. Go ask a math nerd. Take care, everybody.